So pretty basically, histology is just the study of cells and what they look like and how they function. A cell is the basic unit of life. So as we're going through physiology, we're thinking a lot about cells. The arrangement of cells, as well as what they contain, gives the body the ability to perform its necessary tasks. So when you look at a cell, its shape and what's inside it is going to tell you something about how it functions, what its job is. Those two things, what the cell looks like and how it works, are integrally tied together. So when we're doing histology, we're studying the microscopic anatomy of cells and tissues, which is to say we're looking at those cells, we're trying to figure out what parts they have, we're trying to figure out what they look like so we can better understand how they function. So our overarching goal for this lab is to create accurate mental pictures of the body's construction, which is to say we want to know what cells in different organ systems look like, and specifically what different tissues look like. So as we'll see in the next couple of minutes, your body is made up of some pretty basic tissue types that we'll see over and over again, and they have specialized cells that give them specialized functions. The other thing we want to do is be able to translate 2D images to 3D understanding. So when we're doing histology, we'll often have a slide that's like a cut through a tissue, and we put it literally on a glass slide and pointed a microscope at it, right? So we will have some picture in 2D, but your body doesn't work in 2D. You have 3D anatomy and physical space. So it's important to realize that how we cut through our tissues is going to influence what that 2D image looks like. And so we have to be able to sort of toggle between those two views in our minds. And we'll practice that through the lab. So I said we're going to look at tissues. So we're going to go through 4 basic tissue types. We're going to talk about epithelial tissue, which is coverings and linings. So that's going to be things like skin, things like gut lining. We're going to look at muscle tissue, which is tissue that can contract. So our muscle tissue, we're going to see those cells change shape. And as they change shape, they're going to move structures that are attached to them on either end. So when that cell changes shape, it shrinks, it contracts, whatever it's hooked up to has to move closer together. Our third type of tissue is nervous tissue, which is specialized for communication and activity coordination, which is to say nerves are going to send signals, and those signals are going to orchestrate some kind of response in the body. So as we were talking about regulating and homeostasis in lecture, we're going to expect to see our nervous system involved in that process, coordinating responses. And finally, we'll see connective tissue, which provides both physical and functional support. So we'll see that connective tissue physically holds the body up. And we'll also see types of connective tissue that provide functional support to the body, like blood. Blood is actually a type of connective tissue whose job is largely to carry oxygen. Okay. We're going to go into each of these in a little more detail. And as you work through the lab, you'll see actual slides. For right now, we're looking at basically cartoons. So our epithelial tissue are sheets, linings covering body surfaces. So we'll see them lining any type of lumen, which is like a hollow space in the body. We'll see them on the outside of the body in the skin. The characteristics of that epithelial tissue depend on what that lining needs to do, like what it needs to block out, whether it needs to secrete stuff, whether it's designed for absorbing things, or whether it's designed for coming into a lot of contact with stuff. So we're going to see a bunch of different types of epithelial tissue. There are 2 fundamental ways we look at epithelial tissue. One is that we look at the number of layers, and the other is that we look at the shape of the cell. So we'll see that we have both simple and stratified epithelium, which just refers to the number of layers that we see among those cells. So simple epithelium has one layer, so just one layer of cells. So we can see those at the top of this picture here, simple epithelium. Stratified epithelium has multiple layers. So those are those images below, or here we go, these two, that one. Multiple layers of cells composing that lining, creating basically a thicker lining. Now the second way we're looking at epithelial tissue is the shape of those cells. So we'll see that we have squamous, cuboidal, and columnar cells. Now, squamous basically means kind of squiggly. Like in anatomy, you saw that there was a squamosal suture along the side of the skull. A squamous epithelial cell has an irregular shape. So when you see these sort of teardrop-looking shapes, that's a squamous epithelial cell. Cuboidal cell, very simply, is a cube. So almost any way you cut it, you're going to see a square. Columnar epithelial tissue comes in columns. So one way you cut it, you'll see squares. The other way you cut it, you'll see longer rectangular shapes. So those are our columnar epithelial cells. Our second type of tissue we're looking at is muscle tissue, which is specialized for contraction. So we'll see and go into quite a lot of detail in lecture that muscle tissue is going to have force-generating proteins, so basically fibers on the inside. Two examples are actin and myosin. And they're going to be specialized for contraction, so those proteins are going to move and enable the muscle cell to change shape. Right now, what we want to know about is that there are 3 different varieties of muscle. So the traditional muscle cell you think of is something like the biceps, right? Allowing us to move different parts of our body like our limbs. So that's skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is connected to your skeleton. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. So you can think about moving your arm and then use your muscles to move your arm. Our other 2 types of muscle cells do not move voluntarily. So both smooth muscle and cardiac muscle have involuntary responses. So you can't think about smooth muscle or cardiac muscle and contract it, although its action will change. So smooth muscle is found places in your body like around blood vessels, for example. Cardiac muscle is found specifically within the heart. So we'll see that these also look a little different from each other. So here we see some smooth muscle cells. And we'll talk a lot in lecture about how smooth muscle is an effector organ for a bunch of our processes. And we see cardiac muscle cells here. They also have a little bit of a different shape, and we'll go into cardiac function in lecture as well. Third type of tissue we're talking about is nervous tissue. So nervous tissue is really specialized for signaling, but we're going to consider 2 types of cells when we're talking about nervous tissue. The first is the cells that are actually doing the signaling themselves. Those are our neurons. And then we're also going to have supporting tissues called glial cells that basically help the neurons do their job. When we're looking at a neuron, we're going to have 3 basic parts. We'll get into more parts of neurons in lecture. But our basic parts are our cell body. So this is where you'll find the nucleus. We have dendrites, so these sort of starbursts coming out of them, receiving signals. We'll have an axon. And these are stereotypically long and thin. And the axon is transmitting a signal to somewhere else. I'll talk about the function of each of those in class. Right now, we're just thinking about what that cell looks like. Our final type of tissue is connective tissue. This is going to have subparts as well. But connective tissue is united by the fact that it supports other tissues, but also, if you're looking at connective tissue, what you're going to see is a couple of cells widely separated. So they're going to be in a big space, but you're only going to see some cell bodies. So connective tissue is filled by a lot of extracellular fluid. So extracellular, outside the cells. And we'll often call this extracellular fluid in a connective tissue matrix, because this extracellular fluid is also going to contain some structure. So it is going to give shape to this tissue from outside the cells. So we do break connective tissue down into 4 types, and they're going to look pretty different. But all of them are going to have these widely spaced cells. The first is connective tissue proper. So in connective tissue proper, we basically have a gel with a bunch of fibers in it. So when I say a gel, I mean something like gelatin. It's a 3D molecular scaffold filled with water. So the point about the gelatin is it's like a jelly, but there's lots of water in the gelatin that nutrients and waste can move through. The gel can be rigid or fluid. It contains a lot of water, but that doesn't mean you could like pour it out onto the floor. The fibers moving through basically act like threads. Collagen is the most common one. You've probably heard of collagen, something people talk about in their daily lives when we think about things like skin elasticity. So collagen fibers are basically reinforcing connective tissue. Those fibers in the connective tissue can be tough, or they can be elastic. So they can resist compression, or they can be kind of stretchy. Connective tissue can be dense or fibrous, or can also be loose. And specifically, adipose tissue is a type of loose connective tissue. So that's fat, basically. So fat deposits in your body made up of adipose tissue, which is a specialized type of loose connective tissue. The second type of connective tissue we're going to see is cartilage. So the characteristic thing about cartilage is it's made up of chondrocytes. So a chondrocyte is a cartilage cell, essentially. And it's going to be surrounded by a semi-solid ground substance. So like the extracellular stuff around our chondrocytes is solid, and it also has some elastic properties. So it's flexible. And cartilage, like how much cartilage you have in your body, depends on where you are in your life cycle. So one of the cool things about cartilage is that actually your bones start out as cartilage, which then ossifies. So we start out with cartilage that then gets replaced by bone over time. So if you're looking at a fetus, we're going to see a lot of cartilage for those developing bones. We do still see cartilage in adults, so like the tip of your nose will be made of cartilage. We also see cartilage on joint surfaces. So when you have a movable joint, that bone is capped by cartilage, which can resist some of the forces when you make impact with things. So the elasticity of the cartilage is helpful there. Our third type of connective tissue is bone. So bone is characterized by bone cells called osteocytes. So here we see some osteocytes, and you'll recognize bone because you'll see that these osteocytes are in rings. So we see concentric rings of osteocytes and calcified material that's mineralized. So this material between our bone cells is what makes bone hard. It's basically crystals of calcium salt deposited in the gel around the cells. So we'll see these rings of osteocytes and calcified material laid around blood vessels. And we don't think of bone as being bloody when we automatically think of bone, but bone is actually highly vascularized. This tissue is fed by blood, and that's really important for healthy bone growth. So that's what we see here in the center of these rings in our bone tissue. Our final type of connective tissue is blood. So as I mentioned, blood counts as connective tissue. And the reason for that is that blood cells are really widely spaced. They're surrounded by a lot of extracellular fluid. So when we were talking about body fluids in class, we talked about how there's extracellular fluid called plasma in the blood. So that's a special type of extracellular fluid. And since that constitutes at least half of the volume of blood, we classify blood as a connective tissue, and it provides functional support to our other tissues. So now we're going to go forth, and in your lab, you'll see, after you get through a bit of it, there will be a link to a website that is basically a virtual slide box. So you'll see slides of a lot of different organ systems, and you'll see slides of a lot of different cell types. So we're going to poke around through that and try and get a good mental picture of what these different types of tissue look like and what the cells within them look like. We want to be able to differentiate between those different tissues, and what we're using to do this is histology.